what it took to be a knight in the Dark Ages, customs and code of honor. This is not the story you were told in fairy tales. This is the real story, the brutal, beautiful, unforgiving truth about what it actually cost a man to earn the right to carry a sword and ride into battle under a banner. And it begins not with glory, but with a 7-year-old boy standing barefoot on cold stone, watching his mother cry as she handed him over to a stranger. England, 1193. The rain had not stopped for 3 days. The roads leading out of the village of Ashworth, in the county of Yorkshire, were nothing but rivers of mud. The trees bent under the weight of the water, and the sky looked like a bruise that refused to heal. In the doorway of a small stone house with a thatched roof, a woman named Eleanor held her youngest son by the shoulders. Her fingers pressed into the wool of his tunic, as though she could somehow keep him there if she just held on tight enough. But she could not. She had known this day would come since the moment her husband, a minor landholder named Geoffrey of Ashworth, had made the arrangement with Lord Aldrich of Dunmore. Their son Thomas would be sent to Lord Aldrich's household as a page. It was the first step on the long, merciless road to knighthood. Thomas did not cry. He had been told not to. His father had knelt before him the night before, gripping his small hands and speaking in a voice that shook despite his efforts to steady it. "You will not weep when you leave this house," Geoffrey had said. "A knight does not weep, not when he is afraid, not when he is alone, not when the world turns against him. You will carry the name of this family on your back, and you will not let it fall." Thomas had nodded, though he did not fully understand what any of it meant. He was 7. He liked chasing rabbits through the barley fields and pretending sticks were swords. He did not know that in the world he was about to enter, real swords drew real blood, and the men who carried them were forged through years of suffering that most people could not imagine. The journey to Dunmore Castle took 2 days on horseback. Thomas rode behind a man-at-arms named Bran, a broad-shouldered soldier with a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. Bran said very little. When Thomas asked if the castle was large, Bran simply grunted. When Thomas asked if Lord Aldrich was kind, Bran let out a short, dry laugh that said more than any words could. The castle itself rose from the landscape like a fist of grey stone punched up from the earth. Its walls were thick, its towers tall, and the banner that flew from its highest point, a silver hawk on a field of black, snapped in the wind like a warning. Thomas was led through a courtyard filled with the sounds of hammering, shouting, and the clang of metal on metal. Horses stamped and snorted in their stalls. Dogs barked. Servants moved in every direction carrying barrels, bundles of cloth, and baskets of bread. It was chaos, organized only by the invisible hand of hierarchy that governed every aspect of medieval life. Thomas was taken to the great hall, where Lord Aldrich sat at a long oak table, eating a leg of roasted mutton. He was a man of perhaps 50, with grey hair cropped close to his skull, and eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they looked upon, as though deciding whether it was worth keeping or discarding. "So this is Geoffrey's boy," Lord Aldrich said, not looking up from his meal. "Small." That was all he said. Thomas stood there, his heart hammering, his hands clenched at his sides, waiting. Lord Aldrich finally looked at him. "You will sleep with the other pages. You will rise before dawn. You will serve at my table, tend to my horses, clean my armor, and learn to hold your tongue. If you do well, in 7 years you will become a squire. If you do not, you will be sent home in disgrace. Do you understand?" Thomas nodded. "Say it," Lord Aldrich commanded. "I understand, my lord," Thomas whispered. Lord Aldrich returned to his mutton. "Take him away." And so began the life of a page. The reality of it was nothing like the stories Thomas had heard from travelling minstrels who passed through Ashworth, singing of gallant knights and beautiful ladies. The reality was waking in the dark, shivering on a straw pallet in a room shared with 6 other boys, some of whom had been there long enough to have grown hard and cruel. The reality was hauling water from the well until his arms burned, scrubbing floors until his knees bled, and standing perfectly still behind Lord Aldrich's chair during meals that lasted for hours, holding a pitcher of wine that grew heavier with every passing minute. The other pages tested him immediately. A boy named Roderick, the son of a wealthy merchant who had paid handsomely for his son's placement, tripped Thomas in the courtyard on his second day, sending him sprawling into a pile of horse dung. The laughter echoed off the stone walls. Thomas got up, wiped the filth from his face and said nothing. That night, alone in the dark, he allowed himself to cry for the first and last time. But the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, and Thomas began to learn. He learned how to move silently, how to anticipate what Lord Aldrich needed before he asked for it, how to read the mood of a room by the way men held their shoulders and the tone of their voices. He learned the basics of horsemanship from the castle's master of horse, a patient, weathered man named Oswin, who spoke to animals more gently than he spoke to people. He learned etiquette, heraldry, the basics of Latin from the castle's chaplain, and the fundamentals of combat from watching the squires train in the yard every afternoon. He watched them with hungry eyes, the way they moved, the way they struck, the way they took blows and got back up. He wanted that. He wanted it more than anything he had ever wanted in his short life. And slowly, almost without his noticing, the soft village boy began to disappear. In his place, something harder, sharper, and more determined began to take shape. The transformation was not dramatic. It was quiet, daily, relentless, like water wearing down stone. Thomas of Ashworth was becoming someone new. He just did not know yet what that someone would cost him to become. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel, because every week we bring stories like this one that you will not find anywhere else. Real stories of sacrifice, honor, and transformation that stay with you long after the video ends. Subscribe now so you do not miss a single chapter. 7 years passed. Thomas was 14 years old, and the boy who had arrived at Dunmore Castle, trembling and small, had been replaced by a young man with calloused hands, steady eyes, and a quiet confidence that came not from arrogance, but from years of discipline. He had survived the cruelty of the other pages, the endless labor, the cold winters when the castle walls seemed to trap the chill rather than keep it out, and the loneliness that came with being far from everything and everyone he had ever loved. He had not seen his mother in 4 years. His father had visited once briefly, and Thomas had barely recognized the man. He seemed older, smaller, diminished by time and hardship in a way that frightened Thomas more than any training exercise ever had. Lord Aldrich, who was not a man given to praise, had watched Thomas's development with the careful eye of someone who had seen dozens of boys pass through his household. Most of them became adequate. A few became good. Very rarely, one showed the particular combination of physical ability, mental toughness, and moral instinct that marked a truly exceptional knight. Lord Aldrich was not yet certain which category Thomas fell into, but he was interested enough to promote him. On a grey morning in late autumn, Thomas was called to the Great Hall and told he would begin his service as a squire. He would be assigned to Sir Marcus of Blackmere, a knight in Lord Aldrich's service, who had a reputation for being both brilliant in combat and merciless in his expectations. Sir Marcus was 32 years old, tall, lean, with dark hair, and a face that looked as though it had been carved from the same stone as the castle walls. He had fought in the Crusades, had seen Jerusalem, had killed men in the desert heat, and watched friends die in his arms. He carried those experiences not as stories to tell, but as weights he bore in silence. When Thomas presented himself, Sir Marcus looked him over the way a blacksmith examines a piece of raw iron, assessing not what it was, but what it might become. "Can you ride?" Sir Marcus asked. "Yes, sir." "Can you fight?" "I have trained with wooden swords, sir." Sir Marcus almost smiled. Almost. "Wooden swords," he repeated, as though the words themselves were amusing. "Come with me." What followed was the most physically and mentally demanding period of Thomas's life. A squire's duties were exhausting. He was responsible for Sir Marcus's horse, feeding it, grooming it, exercising it, ensuring its hooves were clean and its tack was in perfect condition. He maintained Sir Marcus's armor, which was a task that alone could consume hours each day. Chainmail had to be cleaned by rolling it in a barrel of sand and vinegar to prevent rust. The leather straps of the breastplate had to be oiled. The sword had to be sharpened, the shield inspected for cracks, the lance checked for splinters. If any piece of equipment failed in battle because of the squire's negligence, The consequences could be fatal, not just for the knight, but for everyone who depended on him. Beyond equipment, Thomas trained in combat every single day. Sir Marcus taught him how to fight with a sword, a mace, a lance, and his bare hands. The training was brutal. Sir Marcus did not believe in gentle instruction. He believed that a man who had never been hit hard enough to see stars would freeze the first time it happened in battle, and freezing in battle meant death. So Thomas was hit. Often. He was knocked off his horse during lance training so many times that he lost count. He was struck across the ribs with practice swords until the bruises layered on top of each other like paint on a canvas. He was thrown to the ground during grappling exercises and held there until he either found a way to escape or submitted. But Sir Marcus also taught him things that could not be learned through violence. He taught him the code of chivalry, not as an abstract set of rules, but as a living philosophy that governed every decision a knight made. A knight protects those who cannot protect themselves, Sir Marcus said one evening as they sat by a fire after a long day of training. That is not a suggestion. It is not something you do when it is convenient. It is who you are. If you see a woman being mistreated, you intervene. If you see a child in danger, you act. If you see injustice, you stand against it. Even if standing against it means standing alone. Even if it costs you everything. Thomas listened. He absorbed these words not as lessons, but as truths that settled into his bones. He began to understand that knighthood was not about the armor or the sword or the horse. It was about the man inside the armor. It was about what he chose to do when no one was watching, when there was no glory to be gained, when the right thing and the easy thing were not the same. If this story is making you think about what true honor really means, drop a comment right now and tell us. We read every single one. The real test came during a tournament at Dunmore. Tournaments were not the glamorous spectacles that later centuries would romanticize. They were violent, dangerous, and often deadly. Knights fought in melees, massive, chaotic battles that simulated real warfare, and in individual jousts that could shatter bones, crush organs, and end lives in a single impact. Squires were expected to attend their knights, to be ready at a moment's notice to provide a fresh weapon, help repair damaged armor, or drag their knight from the field if he was injured. During the melee, Sir Marcus was struck from behind by a knight, whose blow landed between the plates of his armor, driving a blade into the gap above his hip. Sir Marcus staggered but did not fall. Thomas saw it happen from the edge of the field. Without thinking, without hesitation, he sprinted into the chaos of the melee, a space where squires were not supposed to be, where a boy without armor could be killed by a stray blow in an instant, and reached Sir Marcus just as his legs gave way. Thomas caught him, braced his weight, and half carried, half dragged him off the field, while blows fell around them like rain. He tore a strip from his own tunic and pressed it against the wound until the castle's physician arrived. Sir Marcus survived. The wound healed, though it left a scar and a limp that would never fully disappear. When he was well enough to speak, he called Thomas to his bedside. "What you did was reckless," he said. His voice was thin, strained. "You could have been killed." Thomas said nothing. Sir Marcus studied him for a long moment. It was also exactly what a knight would do. He reached out and gripped Thomas's forearm, the gesture of one warrior to another, of equals. "You are ready," Sir Marcus said quietly. "I will speak to Lord Aldrich." Thomas felt something shift inside him, not pride exactly, something deeper, a sense of alignment, as though everything he had endured, every blow, every freezing morning, every moment of loneliness and doubt, had been leading to this. He was not yet a knight, but he was close, and the final step would demand more from him than everything that had come before it combined. The process of becoming a knight was not simply a matter of skill or endurance. It was, at its deepest level, a spiritual and moral transformation. The ceremony of knighting, the dubbing, was the culmination of years of preparation, but the night before it was considered the most important part of the entire journey. It was called the Vigil, and it was designed to strip a man down to his essence, to force him to confront who he truly was before he took on the mantle of who he was expected to be. Thomas was told he would be knighted on the feast day of St. George in the spring of his 21st year. He had served as Sir Marcus's squire for 7 years. He had fought in 2 border skirmishes, had taken wounds, had given them. He had seen men die, not in the clean, noble way the poets described, but in the ugly, terrified, desperate way that men actually died, calling for their mothers, clutching at wounds that would not stop bleeding, staring at the sky with eyes that slowly emptied of light. Each death had marked him. Each one had forced him to ask himself whether this path, this life of violence in service of honor, was truly what he was meant for. The night before the ceremony, Thomas was taken to the chapel of Dunmore Castle. It was a small cold room of grey stone with a single window that let in a thin blade of moonlight. A wooden crucifix hung on the wall above the altar. 2 candles burned on either side of it, their flames trembling in the draught that crept through the cracks in the stone. Thomas was given a white robe, symbolizing purity, and told to kneel before the altar. He would remain there until dawn. No food, no water, no sleep, no company. Just himself, the silence, and whatever thoughts came to fill it. The first hour was easy. Thomas prayed as he had been taught, reciting the words that the chaplain had drilled into him over years of instruction. He prayed for strength, for wisdom, for the courage to uphold the vows he would take. But as the hours stretched on, the prayers began to feel hollow, and the silence grew heavier. And Thomas found himself thinking not about God or honor or duty, but about the people he had lost along the way. He thought about his mother, Eleanor, who had died 2 winters ago from a fever that swept through Ashworth. He had received the news by messenger, a few dry lines on a piece of parchment that reduced the woman who had given him life to a fact, a piece of information to be processed and filed away. He had not been allowed to go home for the funeral. Sir Marcus had been sympathetic but firm. "Your duty is here," he had said. Thomas had nodded and returned to his work and had not spoken of it again. But the grief had not gone away. It had simply gone underground, settling into some dark place inside him where it waited, patient and heavy, for a moment like this one. He thought about Roderick, the boy who had tripped him on his 2nd day as a page. Roderick had become a squire as well, serving a knight named Sir Galton. During a border skirmish 2 years ago, Roderick had taken a lance through the chest. Thomas had been 30 yards away when it happened. He had heard the sound, a wet, crunching impact that he would never forget, and had turned in time to see Roderick fall from his horse, the lance still embedded in his body, his hands grasping at the shaft as though he could somehow pull it free. He could not. He died in the mud, and Thomas, who had never liked him, felt something crack open inside himself that had not fully closed since. And he thought about the men he had killed. There had been 3. The first was a raider during the border skirmish, a man with a red beard and wild eyes who had come at Thomas with an axe. Thomas had sidestepped the blow and driven his sword into the man's side. The second was during the same fight, a man who was already wounded, trying to crawl away. Sir Marcus had ordered Thomas to finish him, and Thomas had obeyed, though the act had haunted him for months afterward. The third was during a dispute between Lord Aldrich and a neighbouring lord. A man had charged at Sir Marcus during a parley that had broken down, and Thomas had intercepted him, striking a blow that he had not intended to be fatal, but was. 3 lives, 3 men who had woken that morning, eaten breakfast, perhaps spoken to someone they loved, and then ceased to exist because of something Thomas had done with his hands. The weight of it settled on his shoulders in that cold chapel, like a physical thing, pressing him down, making it hard to breathe. He understood now why the vigil existed. It was not punishment. It was not a test of endurance. It was an invitation to honesty. It was the one moment in the entire process where a man was asked to look at himself, truly look, and decide whether he could carry the burden of what was being asked of him. Because knighthood was not a reward. It was a responsibility so heavy that it could crush a man who was not prepared for it. Dawn came slowly. The first light crept through the window and touched the altar with a pale gold that seemed almost alive after the long darkness. Thomas rose from his knees. His legs were numb, his back ached, and his eyes burned from lack of sleep. But something inside him had shifted. The doubts were not gone. They would never be fully gone. But they had been acknowledged, examined, and accepted. He knew who he was. He knew what he had done. and he knew what he was willing to do. If this story is touching something inside you, type in the comments right now, "Honor is not given, it is earned." Let us see how many people truly believe that. The ceremony itself was held in the Great Hall of Dunmore Castle. Lord Aldrich presided, dressed in his finest surcoat, the silver hawk of his house emblazoned across his chest. Sir Marcus stood to one side, his face unreadable, though those who knew him well could see the pride he was trying to conceal. The hall was filled with knights, squires, pages, servants, and visiting nobles. Torches burned in iron sconces along the walls, and the air smelled of wood smoke and roasted meat. Thomas walked to the center of the hall and knelt before Lord Aldrich. The room fell silent. Lord Aldrich drew his sword, a weapon that had been in his family for 3 generations, and held it flat across his palms. "Do you swear to uphold the code of chivalry?" he asked. "To protect the weak, to speak the truth, to defend your lord and your faith, to show mercy to the defeated, and to live with honor until your last breath?" Thomas's voice was steady when he answered, "I swear it, my lord." Lord Aldrich raised the sword and brought the flat of the blade down on Thomas's right shoulder, then his left. "Then rise, Sir Thomas of Ashworth. You are a knight." Thomas stood. The hall erupted. Men pounded tables, shouted his name, raised cups of wine and ale in his honor. Sir Marcus crossed the room and embraced him, a rare and startling display of emotion from a man who wore stoicism like armor. "Do not make me regret this," Sir Marcus said into his ear, and Thomas could hear the smile in his voice. But even in that moment of triumph, Thomas felt the weight of the oath settling around him like a second suit of armor, invisible, but heavier than any steel. He understood now what his father had tried to tell him all those years ago in that small stone house in Ashworth. A knight does not weep, not because he does not feel, but because he has chosen to carry his pain in service of something greater than himself. And that choice, once made, could never be unmade. The years that followed Thomas's knighting were not the glorious adventure that the songs promised. They were, instead, a long and often painful education in the distance between the ideal of chivalry and the reality of the world in which it had to be practiced. The code was beautiful. The world was not. And the space between the two was where a knight truly lived, in the constant, exhausting effort to close that gap, knowing it could never be fully closed. Thomas served Lord Aldrich faithfully. He rode patrol along the borders of Aldrich's lands, settled disputes between tenants, escorted merchants through dangerous stretches of road, and trained the next generation of squires with the same demanding rigor that Sir Marcus had used on him. He tried to be fair. He tried to be just. He tried to remember that the people he encountered, the farmers, the blacksmiths, the women carrying water from the well, were not background figures in his story, but the very people he had sworn to protect. But the world tested him. It tested him in ways that no amount of training could have prepared him for. The first great test came when Lord Aldrich ordered him to collect taxes from a village that had been devastated by a failed harvest. The villagers had nothing. Thomas could see it in their hollow faces, in the ribs visible beneath the skin of their children, in the way the women held their babies with a fierce, desperate protectiveness that said they knew on some primal level that danger was coming and they could not stop it. Lord Aldrich needed the taxes to fund his military obligations to the crown. Without them, he could not maintain his forces, and without his forces, the entire region would be vulnerable to raids. Thomas understood the logic. He also understood that collecting those taxes would mean condemning some of those villagers to starvation. He went to Lord Aldrich and argued for a reduction. He presented his case calmly, rationally, marshalling every argument he could think of. Lord Aldrich listened, then shook his head. "I cannot afford it," he said simply, "and neither can they afford to be unprotected." Thomas collected the taxes. He did it himself, personally, going door to door, because he believed that if he was going to inflict this suffering, he should at least have the courage to look it in the face. An old woman, when he took the last of her grain, looked at him with eyes that held no anger, only a resignation so deep it was worse than hatred. "God see you, Sir Knight," she said. It was not a blessing, it was a witness statement. That night, Thomas sat alone in his quarters and stared at the wall. He did not pray. He did not know what to pray for. He had followed his Lord's orders. He had done his duty, and he had caused suffering to the very people he had sworn to protect. The code of chivalry had no provision for this. There was no rule that told a knight what to do when duty and mercy pointed in opposite directions. He realized, with a clarity that was almost physical in its intensity, that this was the true weight of honor. Not the battles, not the training, not the vigil. It was this, the impossible choices, the moments when there was no right answer, only less wrong ones. The second test came 3 years later, when Sir Marcus died. It was not a glorious death in battle. It was a slow, grinding death from an infection that set into the old wound in his hip. The wound Thomas had helped treat all those years ago at the tournament. The infection spread despite everything the physicians tried, and over the course of 6 weeks, Thomas watched the strongest man he had ever known waste away to nothing. He sat by Sir Marcus's bed every night. He held water to his lips when he was too weak to hold the cup himself. He listened as Sir Marcus, delirious with fever, relived battles from decades ago, calling out orders to men who were long dead. On the last night, Sir Marcus's eyes cleared. He looked at Thomas with a lucidity that seemed almost impossible given the state of his body. "I was hard on you," he said. His voice was barely a whisper. Thomas shook his head. "You made me who I am." Sir Marcus closed his eyes. "No," he said. "You were always who you are. I just made sure you did not forget it." He died before dawn. Thomas buried him in the churchyard at Dunmore, beneath an oak tree that Sir Marcus had once told him was the most beautiful thing on the entire estate. Thomas planted nothing on the grave. Sir Marcus would not have wanted flowers. He would have wanted the oak. The final test came when Thomas was 43 years old. Lord Aldrich had died, and his son, a young man with more ambition than judgment, had taken his place. The new lord ordered Thomas to lead an attack on a neighboring estate over a land dispute that Thomas believed was unjust. The evidence was thin, the grievance exaggerated, and the true motivation was greed. Thomas refused. He stood in the great hall where he had been knighted 22 years earlier and told the new Lord Aldrich, to his face in front of his entire court, that the attack was dishonorable and that he would not lead it. The silence that followed was the loudest Thomas had ever heard. The new lord's face went white, then red. "You dare defy me," he said. "You are my knight. You serve at my pleasure." Thomas held his gaze. "I serve honor, my lord, as I swore to do in this very hall. If that oath means nothing, then knighthood itself means nothing, and I am nothing. But if it means something, if the words we speak before God and men have weight, then I cannot do what you ask." He was stripped of his title that day. His lands were confiscated. He was given a horse and told to leave Dunmore and never return. He rode out through the same gates he had entered as a terrified 7-year-old boy, 36 years earlier. He did not look back. Thomas spent his remaining years in a small village in the south of England. He lived simply, worked with his hands, and occasionally taught the local boys how to hold a sword properly, though he always told them that the sword was the least important part of being a knight. When they asked what the most important part was, he would go quiet for a moment and then say, knowing when to put it down. He died in his sleep at the age of 58. He was buried in an unmarked grave as he had requested. No banner flew above him, no songs were sung, but the people of that village remembered him, and they told their children about the old knight who had given up everything rather than betray his oath. And their children told their children, and in this way, the truest kind of honor, the kind that asks for nothing in return, lived on long after the man who carried it was gone. What it took to be a knight in the Dark Ages was not strength, it was not skill, it was not wealth or birth or luck. It was the willingness to carry a weight that most men could not even imagine every single day without complaint, without recognition, and without the guarantee that it would ever be worth it. It was the willingness to be broken and to keep going, to be wrong and to keep trying, to be alone and to keep believing that the code, the fragile, imperfect, beautiful code, was worth defending with everything you had. That was knighthood, not the armor, not the sword, the man inside them, and the choice he made every single day to be worthy of both. If you watched until here, it is because this story truly reached you. Leave a comment saying I watched until the end, so I can know you and see who really appreciates the stories on this channel. If this story moved you, hit that like button. It only takes a second, but it helps this channel more than you know. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, someone who understands what it means to carry the weight of doing the right thing, even when it is hard. And if you are not subscribed yet, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Every week we bring real stories of honor, sacrifice, and the human spirit that you will not find anywhere else. This is not just a channel. This is a community of people who believe that the stories that matter most are the ones that make us better. Welcome.